Hi, everybody. I first of all want to thank all of you for the honor, I guess you'd say, of sharing your time with me today. So I hope you like this for a while in the end. Everybody could hear me okay, I guess, right? Peyton, we're good? Okay. This is going to be a random assortment, I guess you'd say, of things that we were thinking about in the fall. I've worked in the retail garden industry for 25 years and answered a lot of questions, and that's what some of this will be all about. First of all, leaves. This is nothing new. You know to rake them up. If you let them sit, they're damaging for your lawn. And, you know, a lot of people use a leaf blower, vacuum. I've heard of people using a weed whacker inside of a garbage can to chop them up, in which case you still have to get them in the can to begin with. My recommendation, if you can, is just to use your lawnmower to go over them. And I do this with a lawnmower as well. Use the lawnmower. If you use a lawnmower when you're mowing your lawn, then everything the soil has used to grow that lawn is going back into the soil. So it's just complete sustainability. You're just putting back into the earth what the earth used to grow the lawn. Now, when it comes to the leaves, I always say, like, what does nature do? Well, obviously, nature would drop those leaves there and it would become a forest floor after a while. But if you chop them up with a mower and let them land, most of the time, well, in most cases, I won't say you won't notice them. Now, obviously, there are some things like oak leaves, a little harder to do. And if you have something like an Osage orange tree or black walnuts, then you have to be careful with that because that's can be damaging to your blades. But in that case, I still think just rake them up and just toss them right into your landscaping, and that'll add to your soil through the years. Don't be concerned if your evergreens drop leaves, just like you lose hair, you know, here and there in the shower or whatever. It's the same way. Evergreens lose leaves, they'll lose them from the inside usually first, but they do drop needles, and it's nothing to be concerned about. If you use a mower, like I said, a mulching mower is made specifically, the blade itself has a little bit of a twist to it like this. And so it keeps the clippings, and in this case also the leaves, it flips them up inside the deck. Mulching mowers have a higher deck for that reason. And if you have one of those mowers that has the little flippy thing on the side to exhaust your leaves, or the clippings and the leaves, you can get a plug to cover that with, and that way everything stays inside that much longer. Fall is a good time for pruning, but not for pruning everything. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. It's always a good time, anytime you see something that's broken or damaged, like this little twig on the side here. If you have to do any major pruning, the picture on the left shows a 3-point pruning cut. And that's done so you can avoid something like this picture on the right. If you have a lot of weight on a branch like that, it's best to do that first undercut, which kind of, now you can't go up all the way that way because your saw will get, it'll get caught in that tree. So you do a little bit going up the first time, and then you cut all the weight off at that second time. And this part in here, just to the right of that number 3, is the branch collar. You want to keep that there. So what you're trying to avoid are leaving stubs like that on the left, and big tears on the side. It is no longer recommended, if it ever was, to use pruning seal. I just think it looks ugly for one thing, but they've discovered that it actually harbors insects. It causes trees not to heal as quickly, and it goes against the arborist standards to use pruning seal now. If you hire an arborist, and which I think you should always do if something is above and beyond your ability, if they are somebody who's going to top a tree or use pruning seal, then you could tell they're probably, I won't say don't know what they're doing, but they're not going according to the standards. Never take more than maybe 25% off of a tree at one time. In most cases, you won't be dealing with that kind of thing. You will be hiring somebody else to do it. But you just want to be careful to avoid damaging that collar. What about flowering shrubs? You might have had this experience before. And I've heard this a lot through the years. My lilac didn't bloom, my hydrangea didn't bloom. It looks beautiful, but it didn't bloom. And that's because flowering shrubs, uh, after they're done blooming is the time to cut them, because right after they're done blooming, they're already starting the process of next year's flowers. They're not exactly creating the buds for the flowers, but the cells and everything that are getting ready to start the flowers for the next year are already being developed. So when we refer to old wood, we're talking about the wood, the stems that that shrub grew last year. And some flowering shrubs like lilac and weigela, for example, bloom on last year's wood. And so if you cut it at the wrong time, like if you were to cut your lilac bush right now, um, you're sacrificing flowers for the following year. Now, when it comes to hydrangeas, there's a whole different ballgame there. Some do and some don't, let's say. We'll get to that in a minute. When it comes to roses, you do very minimal pruning, and usually only things that are damaged. Uh, don't take off too much at one time. The reason for that is you don't want a rose bush to start to develop a lot of new growth for the in the fall. They're starting to go dormant, and that's what you want. That's what nature does. That middle picture, beautiful knockout rose, which by the way is like the best-selling rose ever. Sometimes that's all you can find in a garden center um, anymore. But you could cut those almost any time. You could chop them up, give them a haircut. But again, in the fall, I would say no, because you don't want to develop new growth. The rose bush on the left, maybe you wouldn't even recognize that as a rose bush. That's called Rosa glauca, which means it's got like the bluish cast to the leaves, or sometimes it's called Rosa rubrifolia because of red stems. That is a type of rose bush, an old-fashioned type of rose bush that blooms once a year. And you might be familiar with, there's a lot of roses like that that bloom once a year. And those you would have to be careful of as well, because you don't want to cut off buds. Those would have to also be cut right after they're done blooming. On the picture on the right, you can see I've got a picture of a rose being protected. Now, a lot of the hybrid tea roses, the ones that look like the florist rose, Mr. Lincoln, Queen Elizabeth are some of the popular ones that come to mind. They've been around for years. A big majority of roses of that type are grafted onto rootstock of one specific type of hardy rose. You'll be able to see the root knot at the base of the rose bush, and that's what you're trying to protect. A lot of times the top part of that is not very hardy, but the roots are, and so you want to protect that union at the base, and that's what those leaves are for there. I know people who use styrofoam rose covers. I just don't think they look that pretty. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the roses that are at Gabis were donated by Carl Babst. And he used to make like they look like coffins out of styrofoam, where he would cover 3 or 4 or more roses together in a long row. And okay, so here we talk about hydrangeas. The hydrangea on the right is called Nico Blue. Now, years ago, I've been in the garden business, like I said, 25 years. Years ago, that was the only macrophylla type hydrangea that was available, or one of the few. And that's when I started hearing the questions of, my hydrangeas look beautiful, but they don't have flowers. Now, people would say, I did not prune them, but what happens is winter pruned them for you. Nico Blue just happens to be very marginally hardy around here, and there are plenty more macrophylla type hydrangeas in our area now that are an improvement on that. And I'll show you more in a minute here. But if sometimes you could get the clue, like Endless Summer, for example, is a macrophylla hydrangea that blooms on new wood. See, that's the problem with Nico Blue. Hydrangea macrophylla generally blooms on old wood only. So if you had the wood from last year, you didn't prune it, but winter pruned it for you by dieback, and then no flowers. But the newer macrophylla hydrangeas bloom on old wood and new wood. So sometimes you could tell by the tag, it will say like Endless Summer or Forever and Ever. They give trademark names to give you a clue that, but always read the tag, always read the tag. We are in zone 5, so you want a hydrangea that is going to be hardy in zone 5. If you look at the US map, United States map, the numbers go bigger as you go farther south. So we are in 5. If you get a hydrangea or anything or zone 5 um, or numbers smaller even, it would be hardy in our area. The hydrangea on the left is called Hydrangea quercifolia. It's a great Gatsby. So let me show you here. Think of hydrangeas, they've got 6 families to them. Six members of the hydrangea family, kind of like the Jones family. There would be a Tim Jones and an Andrea Jones, and they're all a little bit different. Hydrangeas, there are 6 different types, and some of them get pruned at different times. When we refer to late winter, that's we're talking like February and maybe March. That's considered late winter. This chart, by the way, comes from the Proven Winners website, and they also have this wonderful little flow chart, I guess you'd call it. This is how it starts. Why is it by hydrangea blooming? And it gives you those options. The other 2 hydrangeas, well, I think they're all on here. Yep, they all are on here. And that's available on their website. This is how I pruned. This is being funny. This is not how I would recommend you prune a shrub, but I jokingly say my policy is to wait 15 or more years before trimming and pruning a mock orange and then breaking apart with your bare hands, which is what I did here this spring. And of course, anytime you have dead wood, you can take it out. It doesn't matter, spring, fall, winter, whatever. If you want to go out there when it's 0 degrees out, you can break off or cut off something that's dead. But I've been working 60 hours a week for the past 10 years or more, and I'm getting older and just getting a little neglectful. So this is the remains of a mock orange that I pruned this year, which gets me to wondering is like, what would you do with all that? And here's one suggestion, maybe even thinking about starting a raised bed garden. Now, I don't think everybody has to have a raised bed. I won't say it's just trendy, that's probably not the right word to use, but it's become very popular to have a raised bed. And you could keep things, a lot of people just like keeping things orderly. It improves drainage. A lot of reasons to have a raised bed, but there are pros and cons. So here's the cons. I get this a lot when I'm in the garden center. How much soil do I need? Well, 4 feet by 8 feet is kind of a standard size for raised bed, I'd say, because you can reach into it from all sides and it's about the size of a piece of lumber, so it works well. Let's say 12 inches. I've got this nice little calculator that is an app on my phone. It's just called Mulching Calculator. And if you look for that little yellow wheelbarrow symbol, that'll tell you got the right one. And I use this all the time at work. And so we'll look at it and it'll say, okay, 4 feet, 8 feet, 12 inches. And all of a sudden you've got to buy 64 bags of topsoil. And that's if you're using topsoil, which is usually not recommended. You want something a little bit better than just plain topsoil. But even at the cheapest, topsoil 64 bags at $1.50 a bag, we're talking about $100 right there. And if you buy the nicer brand soils that have compost, everything mixed in, we're talking a lot of money. Here's my recommendation, what to do with all those twigs and things. Have any of you ever heard of hugelkultur? It is a German word. It just means mound culture or hill culture. And see the way they've done this here, take huge logs and pile smaller branches on top of it. And then you don't have to, now they're using soil from in their, around their surroundings. You could actually take a soil out of the hole to begin with, which was just more work. But this is actually a good way to save on soil, which is one of my reasons for suggesting it. But it makes all that good organic material in there. It holds moisture. Those logs actually become like sponges. After a while, as they're decomposing, they become kind of spongy. They hold moisture. You don't need to water as often. But now not everybody wants something like that in their backyard. So, oh, by the way, beautiful picture of some lichen and moss on a log. That little one on the right is kind of my pet. I have him hidden underneath a evergreen in my backyard, and I pull them out for occasions like this. And the beautiful purple lichen growing on that. There are a lot of fungi, lichen, moss growing that adds to the decomposition process. And you could do this. You could have a regular, traditional raised bed garden that if you want something that looks a little neater, you could do that, and then just pile whatever you want in there like that, and then top it off with soil. This reminds me of what I suggest for container gardens in the spring. If you have a big container, say 24 inches deep, you don't need to fill that entire thing with soil. A lot of people put gravel in the bottom. I've seen where I used to work, we put tin cans in the bottom, crushed up milk cartons, anything so that you don't need to put potting soil in the entire container. You only need maybe the top foot or top 15 inches for annuals. And this is the same kind of process here. So you've got all this stuff in the bottom, and then if you want to buy soil for the top of it, which you would, it looks like those back two beds already have some soil added to them. Okay, that's called hugelkultur. So let's go on to lawns. No, this is not dog poop in the lawn, but lawn, that is an aerated lawn. It pulls up little plugs. Now, fall is the absolute best time to do anything to a lawn. There again, what does nature do? Nature sets seed in the fall, and as plants go dormant, they store things in their roots. And so that's also the best time to use weed control is in the fall, because if you put anything on your lawn to control weeds, it's taking that down into the root zone. Fertilization is better in the fall too. You don't really have to fertilize 4 times a year, in spite of what the major lawn care companies tell you. They've got sometimes, you know what I'm talking about, the 4 steps for lawn care. And they do that because they know people want their lawn to green up in the spring. An organic product with nothing added to it will do the same thing, although you want to use something to prevent crabgrass, maybe if that's a problem. But if you have a really good lawn, you're also going to inhibit crabgrass that way. But mowing your lawn high is always a good idea, and in the fall especially. And anytime you aerate your lawn, it's a big plus. Now there's plug aeration like this, where it actually pulls out little plugs, and it looks bad for a few days, but then that decomposes quickly and goes back into the ground. And but there's also a slit aerator that just cuts little slits in the lawn. The plug aeration is better. Okay, here's a quiz. Who could tell me which one of these is grubworm damage? Take your, we should have the Jeopardy music. Do, 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 do. Okay, anybody have a clue? Take your guess. Okay, let's see which one is grubworms. Number 4. The other 3 are fungus problems. Now, a lot of fungus is caused by overwatering or just the weather we're having. It might be too humid, that kind of thing. But I often see people come to a garden center and instantly they think there's a problem. They think it's insects. And I just hate to see people waste money on products that aren't helpful. If you put an insecticide on your lawn and it's one of those other problems, you're wasting your money, because it's not going to do any good, if you don't have insects. And you can actually have some insects in your lawn and it's not the end of the world. By the way, I forgot to mention back when I was talking about picking up leaves, I hate seeing people spend money on leaf bags also, because it's like, who would throw away perfectly good leaves? Get them all in a bag and throw them away, and they're wonderful for your landscaping. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about grubs, because a lot of people are seeing damage from grubs. And usually the telltale sign, if you think you have grubs, if you can pull up a piece of your sod like that and it comes up very easily, kind of like a piece of carpet, then that's usually a sign that there's damage. A few grubs is not the end of the world. But if you could lift up your sod like that and you see a lot of them, that means the grubs are eating, they're at the root level and they're eating the roots of your lawn. Again, a problem, something important to know though, is the life cycle of a grub. If you were to use the wrong product at the wrong time, again, you are wasting your money, because you're not using the product that at the right time where it's going to actually do any good. So like in the spring, let's go with fall right now, because we're in the fall. The grubs have been laying their eggs. It's late summer, fall. They're they're laying eggs. Let's see here. So they're hibernating over winter. And so you want to use the right product. Now, one of the major products actually changed their formula about 10 years ago. The product you want for fall, one of the active ingredients is called Dilox. Dilox. If you were to look for imidacloprid or chlorantraniliprole, I knew I was going to stumble over that word. But those products work only in the spring. So if you look at always read the label, right? Always read the label. If you look at a product and it says it's intended to use, it says early spring to midsummer, that's for a reason. It's because it's only going to attack the grubs at that time of year. Now in summer, those grubs will turn into Japanese beetles and they're not even in the ground. So then there's no point in putting anything there at the time. Okay, let's move on, okay? Like I said, just always read the label, make sure you're getting the right product. Oh, by the way, the imidacloprid, the one reason that company changed from imidacloprid to the chlorotraniliprole is because the imidacloprid, which is a neonic, and if you're familiar with gardening and know that everybody's against using that, that's because it's bad for the insects. And a lot of insects are, a lot of low-growing weeds are being pollinated by insects, and that's the imidacloprid is bad for them. By the way, not grub damage, just saying. I had to throw that in there. Okay, in the fall, there are still things you can do in your vegetable garden. Of course, we're talking, let's say first we're still planting things. You can still plant things. Look at the back of the seed package. See that spinach says 47 days to harvest. So we're in mid-September right now. You might still get a crop of spinach out, especially if you cover them in days when we might have frost, because we have a lot of nice weather still through the end of October. And actually, just as a freebie, if you look on the package of it, tomato plants, for example, or when you're buying plants, you'll see days to harvest. Early girl is like 55 days, and then there are some tomatoes that are 70 days. That makes a difference. Always look for the days to harvest. But there are a lot of cool weather crops that you can plant early in the spring, and you can sometimes get another harvest out of those or another crop out of those this time of year. The tricky part for some of these things is getting plants. I don't know very many places that sell plants for things in the fall. If you have any tomatoes on your plants, you can pick those and those will ripen indoors. They won't get any bigger, but you can keep them for a long time. Just keep them cool and dry. You could extend the season with, now the milk jug is more of a spring thing because most of the time in the fall, your plants are getting too big for milk jugs. But if you had that new crop of spinach, that might be good for it, or row cover. The picture on the right is what we do. I work at Home Depot. This is what we do in the early spring and also in the fall when frost is imminent. With frost, it's not so much the cold weather, although some plants like it a little colder and they can handle it, like the cold weather crops like the lettuces and spinach and the brassica family. But sometimes when frost lands on something and then the sun hits it in the morning, that's what's damaging. So if you you could cover your plants with a sheet, cover it with a sheet of plastic, but whatever you do, make sure you you take it off in the morning. Otherwise, it's going to be bad for it. Okay, let's talk about mums. I wish we could do our little polling system. Are mums annuals or perennials? What do you guys think? Annual or perennial? The answer is yes. Actually, they're considered tender perennials. Again, let's talk about girls. I have two sisters. I think I can handle colder weather better than my two sisters. Actually, I'm sure that's true. They both live in California. So I'm sure I can handle colder weather better than my sisters. And that's the same thing with moms. Like I said, we'll call it as a family. And some of the moms have names. You've probably seen them just like any other hybrid. And some of them can handle better weather. You'll also, in some ways, they're also more like perennials because they bloom only once. If you were to buy a small mum like this one here, these mums here, $1.98, $2.98, they're just coffee cup size pretty much. Matter of fact, I have one planted just for size over there next to my watering can. Those will not do much more than that this year. Matter of fact, that's the same mum in the middle picture and on the right. That's the same mum. And I planted it, and so you can see it's not going to do much. Each of those buds is going to open, but it's not going to put on much leaf, much foliage growth this time of year. Now, it's possible that that little mum will come back next year, especially if I keep it a little protected, and it does have some other plants around it. So we'll see what happens. Let me know. I'll let you know next year, right? But for the most part, the mums that you see like this have been pushed to grow they've been pushed to grow a lot of flowers. If you have a mum that comes back next year and you start to see it grow about like this tall, 3 or 4 inches, you can pinch it, cut it, whatever, and it will cause it to branch out. That's true with a lot of plants, right? Anytime you cut something down, it branches out sideways. And then you could do that again. I would say no later than the 4th of July. That's just a rule of thumb. And you pinch it again and it branches out. Growers will do that as well. They might even do it more than twice. I don't know. And of course, their mums are one of those day length sensitive plants. And so they do everything in greenhouses and out in fields that we don't normally do at home. Just kind of better off treating those as an annual, unless you can buy a mum in the spring. And sometimes you can see them in garden centers sold by the perennials in the traditional grower's black pot. It'll have the hybrid name, zone, and everything on there, and they're selling it as a perennial, and that would be a little bit different. Okay, fall is for planting. Good time to buy, get some good deals on plants. Be careful if you buy something that's been sitting in a garden center for the whole summer. It could very well be root bound, and I apologize, I don't have a picture of that. I meant to add that in there. But if you take it out of the grower's pot and it's got roots just packed in there, you'll have to loosen that up a little bit before you can plant it and get it in the ground as soon as you can to help it get established. The photo on the right shows wrapping a trunk. Now, that's not necessary. It's not necessary for all trees, but occasionally a young tree, a new tree, will have a problem if the sun hits it in the spring, because sometimes the sap starts to run before because of the temperatures being so drastic day and night maybe, but sometimes the sun will hit it and crack the bark, and that's to protect it for that. So if you use that though, you want to use something that will not cause insects, and also make sure you take it off in the spring. But I don't think that's really something that you need to worry about. You've probably seen when people used to paint the bark on trees white, and that part of the reason for insects and stuff. And I think maybe orchard growers still do that, but nobody else does. It's just not pretty. Oh, and I had to throw this in there. Please take the tags off of your plants. It's kind of like going to the store and then forgetting to take the tag off of your new shirt. It's the same way. And if you have that tag on and leave it tight enough and never take it off, you'll cause that branch to not grow. It might die. Just like a clothesline. My mom had a clothesline several years ago wrapping around a branch of a cherry tree. I just don't think it looks pretty, so I had to throw that in there. Fall is a great time to plant garlic. Did you know it takes like 9 months, 8 or 9 months to grow garlic? And yeah, it takes 8 or 9 months. And there are different kinds, soft neck and hard neck. And I mentioned this in there because soft neck is usually what you see in the grocery stores, but hard neck is actually better for growing in our area. I don't know if you can see in that picture of the hard neck, you can see that stem kind of growing out of the middle of it, that it's got a hard stem in it. And if anybody has recommendations for garlic that they've grown, I've honestly never grown garlic before. I looked for it last fall to try it and couldn't find it. or wasn't sure, I just was hoping to get some recommendations. But by the way, the hardneck uh, grows the scapes. Look at the picture on the right, and garlic scapes are good to eat. I actually, okay, true confession, I bought some garlic one time, had it in the kitchen, and well, this reminds me, don't want to use kitchen garlic, something you buy in the grocery store, and plant it, because most of the time it has been treated not to sprout, because in the grocery store they don't want it to sprout, right? But maybe I bought organic garlic, I don't know what, and it started to sprout, and I just stuck it in a flower pot in the kitchen where I had a plant growing, and it had scapes, and I cut them and added them to a salad or potato, I think baked potato or something. Um, and by the way, although it mentions hardneck, it says the softneck has a longer shelf life. And of course, that's probably why it's the kind you see in grocery stores, because it ships well. You probably realize that a lot of the things that you buy in grocery stores, especially tomatoes, are not grown for taste necessarily. They're grown for how well they ship and how long they will last in transit. And it will be the same way with garlic. So soft neck has a longer storage life, but hard neck stores for 4 to 6 months. So unless you are planning on growing enough garlic to last you through, like all next year, 4 to 6 months is still plenty. Okay. And spring bulbs, if you are a gardener, you might already know this. It's surprising to me that a lot of people don't realize that if you want tulips and daffodils in the spring, you need to plant them in the fall. And you can buy those things in the spring, sometimes already sprouted in little 4-inch cups, but it'll be a lot cheaper, and it's definitely a better selection if you buy them now. Spring bulbs need a vernalization period, a cold storage period. So that's why they do so well in our area. But they do need that cold time. And so this is the time to buy them. You get far better selection if you go shopping now. Plant some color. This pot here shows like Swiss chard, brightly colored Swiss chard, something to add into your pots. Again, if you can get it, or start growing it. And flowering kale and flowering cabbage. Some of the perennials like creeping jenny, which are hardier, hardy a little farther north than us, would really be a nice combination. Creeping jenny and pansies. I should have put pictures of pansies in there. Those are standard. One of the most popular early spring and fall plants, because they can really handle cold weather. I planted pansies, and I've had snow on them before. Sometimes the flowers get damaged, but the plants keep going. They'll last for a long time. Containers. You can rearrange and swap out things in your containers. If you have some annuals that are starting to not do so well, you could substitute them, maybe with one of those little tiny mums. They won't live from year to year in a container. You got to think in containers are like a zone or two colder. We're in zone 5, so you think of something above ground, it's got to be something that'll handle zone 3 or 4. But in most cases, it's still not going to make it through the winter, depending on the kind of pot you have, how much room you have in the pot, how much insulation is around the plant. Now, sometimes it's the container that's not going to manage. The container on the left has what we call spalling, and it's a terracotta container. It's porous, so it absorbs water through the winter humidity, not necessarily just rain, but yeah, rain and humidity. And then as it's, what ice does when it freezes, water freezes, and it expands and cracks, and that's what you're seeing here. By the way, if you should be fortunate enough to have a container that you're able to keep, and maybe keep it under an enclosed porch or something like that, and able to keep it year round, or even a raised bed, be sure you add more soil in the spring if it needs to, because there's nothing worse than seeing plants trying to peek out from above a pot that's lost soil. Soil seems to settle through the years. You can save seeds. I know people that do that. I've done it a few times. It's been a long time. Some seeds are a little easier than others. And buying packages of seeds is always kind of fun. So I've never really been one to do that too much. Um, if you were to, if you had a beautiful hybrid annual, let's say any kind of annual that's a hybrid, you need to know that the seeds are not going to come true. We call that coming true. They're not going to be the same thing. The reason being, kind of like we're talking kids again. A hybrid is a cross between a mom and a dad, so all the plants are going to be different. The children will be different, and yeah, and there are ways around it. Just know that it can be done. If you take the seeds from the first flower on the plant, that's supposed to be better. You want to wait till the flower is dried and already, like you see in the picture of the sunflowers. If you have a seed that's not fully matured, they're not going to do well. You can take cuttings from some of your annuals. Now, not all will do well. This is from a couple of cuttings from coleus that I did last year. And I actually grew these in water because I wanted a good clear picture of the roots. But normally they do better grown in potting soil, vermiculite, perlite, something like that. Geraniums will do well that way, begonias, a lot of things will. It's worth a try. And bringing plants indoors. Now, for the life of me, I've got such an addiction to, these are not my plants, by the way, but I really love Rex begonias, and for some reason, I don't seem to do well with them. But I have a canary wings begonia that I brought in last year, and streptocarparella. I've tried, and this seems to work real well, taking the whole plant and submerging it in a bucket of water for about 10-15 minutes to make sure that any insects that might be in the soil would rise to the top and die. And then make sure you spray the plants for insects or wash them off for insects before you bring them indoors. You want to give them a transition time. If they're used to being outside and the weather's starting to get chilly, and then you bring them into a warm house, that could be a shock to them. And the same thing then when you take them out again in the spring, you want to do it a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And you just make sure that they get transitioned. Now, bulb storage. I mentioned the spring bulbs, the tulips, daffodils, and all those that bloom in the spring. Any bulbs that you plant in the spring will bloom during the summer. So we're talking about things like dahlias, cannas. What do we have here? Dahlias on the lower left, gladiolas on the upper right, and cannas on the bottom. And those are all tender bulbs. They will not make it through a winter. They're not something that is native in our area. But you can take those like the lady's doing right there. You let the foliage stay for a while to let them photosynthesize. And then when it's pretty dry, you can cut the foliage off. You don't want to wash anything, just let it dry naturally. You could store it in sphagnum moss. I have actually, I think, just used newspaper. It's been a while since I've done that. And then you'll have them for next year. And those things multiply. Now, cannas, I've noticed, I planted cannas several years ago, and when I dug them up, it was like, I would say, like a rack of antlers. There were so many that they had gone this way and that way. It was kind of cool. And then you've got the same thing to plant for next year. Now, for some people say cannas will come back next year for them in our area. And I'm not doubting that that happens, but generally they are considered tender bulbs here. So if you have them in a protected area, they might do well. And then wildlife. When you're cleaning up your garden, think about what nature does. Nature leaves things for the birds. A friend of mine recently mentioned was like the stems of flowers, like daylily, the stems. There are a lot of things that birds use or insects use as protection. They use it to, they'll eat things. And Yeah, and so now there are varying opinions on that. A lot of people will say clean everything up, and a lot of people just like a nice clean garden. I kind of like the nature, the natural look of having seed heads still go through the winter. If you're going to feed the birds, or if you have been feeding them, make sure you keep feeding them because they've come to a point where they're dependent on you. You can always just concentrate on planting native plants, native native flowers and shrubs, and then that way they will have something as long as you don't cut those down. If you have a bird bath, make sure you go out there every once in a while, make sure there's water in it, and break the ice if needed. Oh, and I don't know if any of you have done this. I gotta be honest, I have never done anything with the rose hips. I have a beautiful rose bush I'll show you in a minute. And now, but rose hips have a lot of vitamin C in them. The lower right picture shows I think that's a Rosa rugosa. Now, not all roses have rose hips. We talked a little bit earlier about the old-fashioned roses and the hybrid teas and those. The old-fashioned roses that bloom once a year are more likely to have them. I hate to say they're the only ones that will have them, but that's actually the seed of a rose bush. So you know how when you grow a tomato plant, you've got the flower first, and then the flower falls off, and you have a tomato. That's the same thing here with the rose bush, a rose hip. They're called rose hips. And very, very high in vitamin C. They're sour or tart, and but you can make tea out of them. You can make wine out of them. Maybe I'll try that this year, and make jams and jellies out of them. And I honestly don't know why I haven't tried it before. This is the rose bush I have in my backyard. It's called William Baffin. Now, you know, I mentioned earlier that there are some roses that are so hardy in our area that you don't have to protect. William Baffin is named after a Canadian explorer. There's a series of roses called the Canadian Explorer series, and they're all hardy in Canada. So they're very easy to grow. I planted it 25 years ago, probably way too close to that garage, as you can see. It has rose hips on it. It is very easy to take care of. I hardly do anything to it. I've pruned it maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. Every now and then I'll go out and prune something if it's dead. But anyway, and I'm looking forward to doing something with rose hips there. Before winter, make sure you water everything real well, especially evergreens, so that they could have enough stored for winter. If you have hoses, you want to make sure, and actually always recommend I call it bleeding the end of the hose. You can imagine what I'm talking about. If you turn off the hose at the house and leave your hose fully engorged with water on a hot summer day, that's you're asking for trouble there. I think it's one reason why hoses might break. So you want to drain that off. But in the wintertime, some houses don't have a frost-free faucet, and you might want to look into that. Otherwise, you have to turn your faucet off from the inside. If you have an irrigation system, you probably already know to take care of that one. Okay, here's one that I say, do as I say and not as I do. You can take, clean off your tools. I don't have that many tools. I have a favorite little 3-prong trowel thingy, a cultivator. And I have had that for, yeah, probably 25, 30 years or more. And it's my favorite. I don't clean my tools like I should, but yeah. But if you want to, you could take a bucket of sand and an oil and just dip it and kind of like, what's the word? Yeah. Yes, and if you're trimming a tree or shrub that has a disease problem, make sure you clean your pruners in between. Okay, power equipment. This is something that like at my job, every spring people will come in with a lawnmower that won't start, and almost always it's because they left gas in it through the winter. You want to make sure you, at the end of the season, that you empty your lawnmower of gas, and or let it dry, mow something, I don't know, or just let it sit there. Some people just let it sit and run. You could also put a gas stabilizer in it. And then I would say most people would probably should clean all that gunk off the underside of your deck. A lot of people do that after every mowing. And some mowers, the newer mowers, have a little port on top that you could attach your hose onto and let your blades run and clean it off every time you're done. But definitely, if I can say anything about power equipment, it's just make sure you get the gas out of it. Houseplants will slow down during the wintertime. You won't have to water as often, and you should not fertilize because you don't want to encourage new growth. You want to let them slow down and go dormant. And if you bring any plants in from outside, make sure you keep those secluded until you know that they're behaving. You don't want to infect everything else in your, like this. These are not my plants either, but if you brought something in that had insects, you could probably infest that whole area there. Just a note about Christmas cactus. And by the way, let's go here. Holiday cactus. I saw in a Facebook group one time somebody saying, "Oh, now we're trying to be PC. We can't say the word Christmas." Well, it's not that at all. There are 3 different types. There are actually more than that. But they actually look a little bit different, and they bloom at different times. Did you know that Christmas cactus and those are actually jungle plants? They're not from an arid region. They're from an area that likes a lot of humidity. But they are also daylight sensitive and cold sensitive. So even though they grow in a jungle area, they will bloom better when it's a little cooler, but they can't handle too cold of a weather. So like you could keep them in, and when they say dark, you could even put them in, if you want to force them to bloom at a specific time, you could even put them in a closet, put them in a box or something so they get no light at all for 8 weeks at 60 to 65. But if you have them in a cool area, don't have to worry about the dark treatment. They'll just do their own thing. Okay, this is what I do. Now I showed you the beautiful blue. You could see the rose bush not in bloom in the lower corner there. That's the view outside my back window. And so in the front, I've got some hostas, some daylilies. That was taken early in the spring. Some of this stuff isn't up yet. But if you go around the corner, the little bit of yellow in the lower left picture is a spirea. I think gold flame, maybe. I've had it for many years. And there are so many newer varieties out now. In the picture on the right, you'll see that same spirea, and then behind it, I've planted a brandywine viburnum to fill up that space. And in the meantime, when I'm walking around that big backyard, which thankfully my neighbor mows, if I have little twigs and things, I just crack them up and put them on top there. That's the way I mulch. I just keep saying, what would nature do? What would nature do? I am not going to throw away sticks. And my neighbor takes care of a lot of things like that for me, but I'm not the type of person who's going to go start a fire. I don't know what I'm doing. So you don't want me starting a fire in my own backyard. But I like the idea of having it sit there and do what nature does. And then, of course, burning adds carbon you don't want that either if you can. Now, not everybody likes that look, but I still think you could throw your branches and twigs in some places behind the shrubs. I call it composting in place. The one last thing I want to mention is always visit your local garden center. You probably know this, maybe not, but garden centers are going to have more available depending on when things are blooming. So if you visit a garden center in the spring, which is when everybody does, right? Memorial Day, Mother's Day, big times for garden centers. But you won't see some of the same plants that you will see now. Like the autumn joy sedum on the left, which is a succulent perennial, was perennial of the year at some point when it first came out. Beautiful plant, very easy to take care of. You won't see that in the garden center in spring most of the time because garden centers are packed full of annuals, right? And people want to buy things when they're in bloom so you can see what they're like. So this is a good time to visit a garden center. I highly recommend it. And just a few pictures here. This is the brandywine viburnum that I've planted. Viburnums is a great family of plants. Flowers in the spring, berries in the fall, native plants, and different sizes, different habits. And Rudbeckia blooming now, or getting ready to bloom. This is a hydrangea called Little Lime. there are, like I said, 6 different families of hydrangeas. I think 3 or 4 of them hardy in our area, and they change colors. Different ones will change colors. Just to note, the macrophyllus are the ones with the big flowers. Macrophylla means big leaf. It's also called sometimes big leaf hydrangea. Those are the ones that will turn from pink to blue if you have acidic soil. It might be tricky if you live in an area that doesn't naturally have acidic soil. You might spend a lot of time trying to get those flowers to turn blue. And again, some hydrangeas might be easier to do that than others just because of the way they have DNA too, but just the way they're made. And the white hydrangeas like this one will often turn, like sometimes have a little greenish tinge to them, and then they turn, not all turn pink. There's so many different kinds out there. Hybridizers are having fun, they make what we want. Hybridizers spend a lot of time crossing plants, hybridizing, taking a mom and a dad, crossing them together, and selecting the best every year. So it'll be like 6 or 7 years before a new hybrid comes out, and after being tested. Beautiful foliage from a hydrangea. This is Hydrangea quercifolia. Quercus is the Latin name for an oak tree, so it just means it's a hydrangea with oak leaves, oak-shaped leaves like an oak tree. And here is an echinacea. You're probably familiar with the purple coneflower. This is a series called Cheyenne Spirit. And I thank you. I think that's all. If you have questions, I would be glad to take them. And Peyton, are we good?
Yep, I have a couple questions in the chat if you want me to read them out for you.
Okay, great.
All right, let's see.
I think I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Okay, the first one says, I don't know if I don't think I'm going to pronounce this right. The hugelkultur, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, hugelkultur, yeah.
Okay, I was close. Okay, reminds me of making a berm, ? So I guess that's kind of a question. And then yeah, okay. Any comments?
Yeah, it is a berm basically. However, a lot of people just make berms by piling up soil, or they'll rake soil from, like we did a garden in the back of our yard. I have a long backyard. We did a garden several years ago, and we just took a hoe and shovels and took soil out of the pathways and piled it. So thankfully my neighbor has leveled it, because it's just me and my daughter. I don't have a garden back there, but yeah, you could do it that way. The difference with hugelkultur is you're starting with really, really big logs, and those logs, as they decay, hold moisture in, and they become like a sponge and hold moisture in. And then of course, all those trees and things, I mean, a regular berm wouldn't necessarily, I suppose people do it that way, but that's probably the only difference I could see.
Okay, and then let's see, next question. How do you plant bulbs under or around trees? I have one maple, one oak tree. It's very big and very old. Oh, she meant spring bulbs. Okay, so how do you plant spring bulbs under and around trees?
Well, that is kind of tricky, because depending on the tree, sometimes the root zone doesn't allow you to plant things very well. I don't know that, I mean, I hate to say I wouldn't recommend it, but in some ways it just seems like it's going to be a problem. I don't know. I just don't know that I would do it. And it also depends on how big the tree is now, because if you've got a tree, let's say right now let's say it's 6 inches across, and I don't know how far out you're thinking of going with these bulbs, but the tree is eventually going to get bigger and bigger. And some trees have like that, I call it a shoulder area. Maybe that's not the right term. The right term is escaping me right now. But you know how the tree comes down like this, that it has that angled area, and that's going to, as the tree gets wider, that area is going to be bigger, and I don't know. Yeah, I just wouldn't do it. I also want to caution, while you're at it, thinking about it, when people plant, they try to make like a tree ring around a tree like that, and sometimes I see that too. If you put too much soil on top of of the roots of a tree, you could damage it. Now, I don't know if you did it real close around, you could, but I've seen people put sandboxes around trees. Nothing, that's never any good. You damage the roots of the trees that way.
This is just as a comment. They said, would like to comment about garden lawn tidiness, as I've recently learned it is better to have untidy areas to provide pollinators places to winter.
Yeah, I like that. Do you know what? I'm going to mention a lady's name. Now, I grew up in Chicago. We grew weeds. That was it. We didn't have a backyard. And the first thing I wanted to do when I was in college was grow things. And one of the first books I read back then was by a woman named Ruth Stout. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of her, Ruth Stout. And the the book is called the No Work Garden Book or something like that. And she's famous for her method of using lots of mulch, just cover everything with mulch. And I like the picture of her, the front of her book shows this old lady, she was old at the time, just kind of like laying back in a wheelbarrow because she was being lazy. And I laugh at that because I say, oh, and the cover of her book says something about for the lazy, the the indolent, and something else. And I think that's me. That's me. My natural default mode is not to want to do that much work. And so for me, yeah, I just like that idea of leaving things like nature would to us. Now I realize some people live in neighborhoods that, where it's expected by the neighbors to have everything nicely manicured. But there's still ways to leave some native stuff. Thank you.
All right, next question is, I grew vegetables in some individual containers, like 15 by 15. Can I reuse that soil next year, or do I need to replace it?
I don't see a problem with it, but if you feel better about it, you could take the top part of it out, because if you said 15 by 15, I'm assuming 15 inches deep as well, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I've done it myself plenty of times. I haven't noticed a problem. Um, but I also have done it where I will take off the top part of it, and which also is a good way to think about maybe using the hugelkultur method with a pot, because rather than putting, like I said, we've done milk cartons and tin cans, and some people use gravel, maybe use pieces of twigs and stuff on the bottom, and then not feel so bad about using. I'm just cheap. I don't want to buy new soil, I guess, every year. Anybody else have experience one way or the other? I like to have interaction here. But you know what? And some of the potting soils, like if you're planting something in a container, it's recommended that you use potting soil, not garden soil. And the potting soils usually have fertilizer in them, but they're only intended to last for a few months. And if you're in a container, you're watering more often. Containers have to be watered almost every day. And so my thought is, if you're reusing that soil, you'd have to fertilize more often. But I've never seen a problem with it.
All right, and we just have one more comment here. Chris, who mentioned the lawn tidiness earlier in the pollinators, said worth mentioning the pollinator pathway project. Everyone can make sure their land includes native shrubs and flowers that attract pollinators. And then he said, thank you so much. Took many notes.
Thank you. Maybe Chris would want to say something to everybody. I see Chris looks like she's wanting to talk, right?
Hi, Lynn, and hi,
Hi.
everyone. Just to let you know, I have managed to find your very nice webinar today, and I am listening to it from New York.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so as I said, I took many, many notes, and I am going to be one of those people that is planting garlic. Yeah, and about the pollinator pathway project, I don't know how widespread it is, but has been gaining traction in the Northeast here, New York, Connecticut. The point of origin may have been around here, I don't know, but it stands to reason that anywhere where you want to have bees and need bees to be pollinating, that to support them, by having the native shrubs and flowers that they like to have. And so basically the beauty of this project is that anybody at a grassroots level with their own property can pitch in.
Very nice. Yeah, we need pollinators to, or I don't know if you've seen pictures like what would happen if we didn't have pollinators for our food. The
Yeah,
grocery store.
yeah.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
And thank you, Lynn. As I said, I took a ton of notes.
Thank you. By the way, I do have a YouTube channel. It's just the Lynn Barbee channel. I've got a few things on there just for fun. Most of the stuff I have on there, my other job is teaching business classes at Ivy Tech, so I can help you write your resume on that. I got videos on that too, but there are a few garden videos as well.
Thank you again, Lynn.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I hope it was worth your time.